I apologize again for having to do this in English, which is not my tongue, but the other possibility was Spanish, which is even worse. Okay. Barely 10 months ago, on the 26th of April of 2019, during a conference at this very university, Alain Badiou gave a definition of architecture. The definition is as follows. Architecture is the violent interval between the real and the symbolic. But in fact, Badiou didn't say that exactly. What Badiou actually said was the following. That architecture should be like a type of violent interval between the real and the symbolic. This is a weaker version of the definition I presented first, as it makes use of a modality, a simile, and a generic form. However, for the sake of this presentation, I will work with the stronger version quoted above, and it will be the point of departure for what I wish to say here tonight. So I will work with this. Architecture is the violent interval between the real and the symbolic. I have three spontaneous reactions to this definition. First, the definition makes use of well-known Lacanian terms, like the real and the symbolic, but crucially leaves aside the imaginary. The third term involved in Lacanian constructions involving language and the unconscious. But it must be noted that the exclusion of the imaginary has one immediate consequence. Meaning is excluded from the definition. And this is so because Lacan specifically excluded meaning from language, that is, from the symbolic, as early as his seminar 3, where I quote, he said, "Meaning is by nature imaginary." Thus, architecture is not a question of meaning, which is an approach that I have defended in my contribution on a volume that appeared in 2014, where it's so difficult to speak about architecture. My second spontaneous reaction is that the definition is not only an attempt at defining architecture, but also an attempt at trying to situate it. Thus, it tacitly assumes the question, where is architecture? Both with respect to itself and with respect to the other arts. Indeed, according to Badiou, the position of architecture among the arts is unusual. He proposes a three-way partition of the arts. Arts of contemplation, where the materiality of the work of art is offered to the eye, as in painting or sculpture. Arts of duration, where the work exists in its deployment in time, as in music or film. And arts of the body, where the work exists in the organic expressions of the human body, the human voice included, as in the theater. But Badiou notes that architecture doesn't fit squarely in any of these categories, because architecture partakes of all three of them. It is an art of contemplation, in that it is quite obviously a visual art. It is an art of duration, not only because it exists in time and is materially conditioned by time, but also because it is a witness to the passage of time. And it is an art of the body because it is directly concerned with living bodies, with their lives, movements, needs, etc. Inasmuch as architecture transverses this three-way partition, Badiou concludes that architecture is unclassifiable, unclassable, he says. And architects are the agents of an ungraspable, elusive diagonal that runs through all these forms of art, but doesn't fit squarely in any one of them. Let me note at this point that Badiou, who has written extensively about poetry, leaves the poem aside in this classification. And I will come back to this omission later. And finally, my third spontaneous reaction to Badiou's definition is that it is almost oracular. Indeed, after stating his definition, Badiou quickly ends up his lecture by saying, voila, leaving us with the task of unpacking it and perhaps even interpreting it. So let's proceed. At the beginning of Badiou's definition, there is a name, architecture. There is little to say here, except that names are unstable, as perhaps Plato was the first to notice in his letter 7. Indeed, architecture may name a certain discipline, perhaps even a certain theory, in the modern sense of the term, that is a set of operations that work on and generate a certain écriture. But architecture may also name, metonymically, the material objects produced by architects, the buildings themselves. It is in the unstable character of the name architecture that Badiou finds much food for thought. Indeed, if a building is destroyed, does its architecture remain? If the Cathedral of Notre Dame burns, as it did last year, an example thoroughly examined by Badiou in his lecture, has its architecture burned with it? Is architecture only an idea, or is it inescapably connected to bodies that dwell, pray, take refuge in it? Notice that what Badiou has offered is a definition of the term architecture, not of buildings. The term architecture names, but buildings themselves do not. A building is not a name of anything. And this is important to bear in mind for something I will develop later. And following the name architecture in Badiou's definition, following that is the definiendum, there is an interval, a violent one at that starts the definiens. Architecture is an interval. Now, what is an interval? It is an opening, a distance between 2 points in space or time. An interval is what is at stake in Zeno's paradox of Achilles and the tortoise. According to the story, Achilles will never reduce to zero the interval between him and the tortoise, provided that the tortoise has a head start and keeps moving. But what Zeno did not see, Lacan did. Indeed, Achilles will not catch up with the tortoise, but the tortoise can surpass it. Achilles can and probably will win the race, but what Achilles cannot do is reduce to zero the interval between him and the tortoise. In this, Zeno's paradox is another case of there is no rapport sexuel. But Lacan noted a second thing concerning this paradox, and that is that the tortoise does not escape the destiny that weighs upon Achilles. Achilles will end up catching up with the tortoise at infinity. Now, this violent interval, which architecture is supposed to be, lies between the two terms that frame its limits. That is the real and the symbolic. Architecture is thus the violent interval between the real and the symbolic. It is a space, a distance in between them. Now, what can such an interval be? First of all, an interval is not an intersection. I mention this because Lacan himself has worked with the idea of intersections between the three domains that define his Borromean knot. For example, he calls the intersection between the real and the symbolic the jouissance phallique, that is, the jouissance that fails. Has Badiou given us just another name for the jouissance phallique as his definition of architecture? Not really. Again, intersections are not intervals. But if so, we need to be more specific about intervals. We have said that an interval is an opening, a distance between 2 points. As such, it looks like the opposite of an intersection. But let's try to be much more precise and make use of a simple mathematical notion of interval. So let's say the following. An interval is a set I of real numbers lying between any two numbers. So for example, the set of numbers between 0 and 1 constitute an interval. And as you see, in the interval you can find 0, 0.11, that decimal expansion of pi, 1.459, etc., the square root of 0.3, 7/8, 1, etc. Now, a key question regarding intervals is whether its limits, 0 and 1 in this case, belong to the interval or not. In fact, 3 different types of intervals are possible. Thus, we have open intervals, formally noted with parentheses. So, parentheses 0, 1 parentheses, which means that 0 and 1 are excluded from the interval. Then we have closed intervals, denoted formally by square brackets. So we have square bracket 0, 1 square bracket, which means that 0 and 1 are included in the interval. And then we have semi-open intervals, which come in two flavors. One is included and the other one is excluded, and vice versa. Denoted by parentheses 0, 1 square brackets, in which 0 is excluded, 1 included, and square bracket 0, 1 parentheses, in which 0 is included and 1 excluded. Given this simple notation, we are faced with two interesting questions. The first one is that given that intervals are defined as sets of real numbers between any two numbers, what does it mean to say that there is an interval between two concepts, like the real and the symbolic? I will not be able to discuss this question in detail here, but let me say the following. Yes, an interval can be taken as a mathematical notion, as I have been doing here, or as a figurative one. In fact, sometimes we use interval to denote a pause or a break between two events. But this reading makes no sense as a definition of architecture. Thus, I would like to suggest the idea that an interval between two concepts is a metaphor. This is not to dismiss the notion of interval, nor to degrade it. On the contrary, metaphors are one of the two key processes of language according to Lacan, the other one being metonymy. However, it will take a special type of metaphor to do the work needed here. Indeed, metaphors are usually taken as semantic devices of substitution. Instead of A, we mean B. But if we keep closer to Lacan's original idea, metaphor and metonymy are symbolic processes, not imaginary ones. This means that metaphor is an asemantic or pre-semantic process of substitution. Thus, if we can make sense of the idea of a purely symbolic notion of metaphor, then we may have a tool to explore the nature of Badiou's interval even further. But enticing as it may sound, I will have to leave this idea for now, because it would take us to complications for which we have very little time tonight. However, if we return to Badiou's actual definition of architecture, not the one I have imposed on him, the one that reads une espèce d'intervalle violent, that is, as a type, a form, a species of interval, then the way is open to a non-mathematical character of architecture's interval. The second interesting question that emerges from the typology of intervals stated above, that is, open, closed, and semi-open intervals, is of course, what kind of interval is Badiou's violent interval between the real and the symbolic? Here are the possibilities. So, is the interval one an open interval in which both the real and the symbolic are excluded from the interval? Or is the interval a closed interval in which the real and the symbolic are part of the interval? Or one of the two flavors of the semi-open interval? Of course, the answer depends on what Badiou takes the real and the symbolic to be. And here is where it starts to get interesting. In his conference, I believe Badiou makes use of two different notions of the real. On the one hand, there is the classical Lacanian notion of real, that is the real as impossibility. To state it more clearly, the real can be seen as the inevitable residue of any process of symbolization. Whenever one makes use of the symbolic, something ends up being excluded. Something is set aside as unsymbolizable. That something could be transcendental, like sexuality in the case of Freud, or contingent, depending on what has been actually symbolized, like in Derrida, for example. So the classical Lacanian real is a failure, structurally installed in the symbolic itself. Let me call this version of the real one. Let me be more precise, as we will make use of this notion in a moment. I will quote from Lacan from one of his early seminars. Quote, "What's at issue regarding language," says Lacan, "is a succession of absences and presences, or rather of presence on a background of absence constituted by the fact that a presence can exist there. There is no absence in the real. There is only absence if you suggest that there may be a presence there where there isn't one." End of quote. If the symbolic is an interplay of absences and presences, then the real has no absence whatsoever. As the Argentinian psychoanalyst Oscar Mazzotta once said, the real is thick and dense like the liver of a goose. Given that there are no absences in the real, the symbolic, which is an interplay of absence and presence, cannot symbolize it. That is exactly what I want to call the real one. But there is another notion of the real which I believe Badiou also makes use of, which has been defined by Zizek as the inverse of the real one. If real one was the real as impossibility, then this new notion, call it real two, is the impossibility as real. That is, a real that, even if unsymbolized, is confronted as such by the symbolic. Badiou makes use of this real too in his conference. For example, he urges the symbolic process to import a fragment of the real and to get closer to the real. It is also in this sense, I believe, that he talks about, I quote, the real of social inequality, unquote. That is, this is a real that must be confronted by architecture and not just left aside as a residue of symbolization proper. It is a real that directly confronts the fact that bodies dwell in and are an inescapable part of architecture. So we have two uses of the real. Real 1 and real 2. The real as impossible and the impossible as real, respectively. Which one will define Badiou's interval? We will see in a moment. Before that, we should establish what version of the symbolic is Badiou employing for his interval. And here again, we find in Badiou's conference two notions of the symbolic, which I will call symbolic 1 and symbolic 2. Symbolic 1 is classical Lacan, again, the symbolic as a structure of pure differences. As such, symbolic 1 is an interplay between a missing signifier, an absence, an empty set, and the lexicon, a treasury, a trésor of signifiers, which we call L. Such interplay is traditionally called the signifier pair. The signifier pair is what you find there, a missing signifier and all the rest of signifiers. There are other versions of the empty set, such as -1 or extimité or absence or zero signifier, but they all reduce to the same. The symbolic works because there is a missing piece which allows all the other pieces to move and produce signifier effects. Very much like in the moving squares puzzle that I don't know if you have seen, or if this is just a purely South American game in which you have to find again La Joconde moving the squares. This is only possible if there's an empty space, otherwise no movement is allowed. The symbolic is exactly like this. There's an interesting question though. Some people have objected saying, yeah, but the difference with language is that there's no figure that you have to compose. And I'm not sure that this is true. I think that the big other is wise enough to just tell us what we have to say. But if that's another talk. Okay. Badiou makes use of another sense of the symbolic, which I will call the symbolic 2, and one that essentially reduces to the idea of representation. I.e., that is the notion that A is in place of X. So, for example, in his lecture, Badiou states that architecture is a symbol of the death of the powerful, as with the Egyptian pyramids, or of the diversity of gods, like with the Greek temples, or of the power of the state, as with Versailles, or of the wealth of the rich, like les grandes villes of rich people. How to integrate this use into our picture? Well, first of all, symbols are not part of the symbolic. Symbols are representations and belong inside the imaginary, and as such ought to be excluded from Badiou's definition. And second, this idea of symbol as representation seems to be part of the inevitable visual character of architecture. Recall that architecture draws a diagonal across all three types of art: visual, duration, the body. So we must assume or incorporate this visual property within architecture. If symbolic 1 was defined as a system of pure differences, now symbolic 2 commente. Here the differences are not pure any longer. But at the same time, the symbolic 2 is the result of the symbolic 1 at work. Only that, Badiou argues, that architecture must not, quote, sacrifice the real of social inequality in favor of the unity of the symbolic, end of quote. I believe here lies the gist of the question. What is the unity of the symbolic? It is not just the idea of the pure interplay between the missing signifier and the trésor or the lexicon of signifiers. Crucially, it is also the idea that what governs such interplay is the big other. The name of the Father, the state, the law, God, a figure of authority. One of such figures is grammar, with big G, so to speak. Grammar is the unity of the symbolic, for it determines that all of its products, words, phrases, texts, discourses, are non-singular. That is, are the result of predetermined operations that will make them look very much alike. Any deviation from prescribed grammar is rendered ungrammatical and rapidly dismissed, very much like mad individuals taken to psychiatric asylums. The symbolic, under big grammar, must generate ununique products. Now we can take Badiou's symbolic too as an impure form of the symbolic, that is, as a non-unified symbolic in the following sense, that architecture should aim at the unique, at the singular, so to speak, at the ungrammatical. And that is only possible if it defies the big other as big grammar. That is, if it defies the unifying order that rules the interplay between signifiers, and at the same time making full use of them. So let us regroup. We considered a typology of intervals that offered open, closed, and semi-open intervals, depending on whether the limits of the interval were included or not within the interval. Next, we consider Badiou's interval between the real and the symbolic. And finally, we asked what kind of interval Badiou was referring to. These, again, are the possibilities. Furthermore, we have discovered two different notions, such each of the real and the symbolic. The real one and the real two, on the one hand, and symbolic one and symbolic two on the other. And briefly recapitulating, the real one is the real is impossible, the real two, the impossible is real, the symbolic one, the interplay between the missing signifier and the lexicon, and the symbolic two, the symbolic one minus the idea of a big other behind it. So let's try to define Badiou's interval. There's a key moment in his lecture in which Badiou states the following, I quote, Architecture must import the division of the real and the symbolic within a space capable of withstanding the universality of such gap without being hung up on the process of internal differences inside the symbolic itself. Clearly, the space Badiou is referring to is the interval. And such interval must be able to withstand the universality of the gap between the real and the symbolic without being hung up on the unity of the symbolic itself. The universality of the gap I read as the infinitude of the gap. But recall that it is at infinity that Achilles catches up with the tortoise. And no wonder that Badiou states that such an interval must be violent. Thus, I propose the following as Badiou's interval. Namely, R1 and S1, the real one and symbolic one are excluded, but the real 2 and the symbolic 2 are included. Thus, we are left with this to work with as the architecture's interval. Architecture is thus the interval capable of withstanding the infinity of the violent inclusion of the real 2 and the symbolic 2 within an interval that excludes both the impossible as unsymbolizable and the unifying niceties of a pure symbolic. Thus, we can reword this last statement in terms of Badiou's actual definition. Architecture should be the space in which the real and the symbolic meet violently at infinity. Now, is this itself an impossibility? Does architecture exist as such, or is it infinitely deferred in modality? Is architecture something that is not, but something that constantly should be? And furthermore, how is this violent interval to be actually construed? How does the real and the symbolic catch up? I don't know. I have no direct answer to all these questions. But I will try to provide an indirect approach, even a negative one, by incorporating Badiou's silence about poetry in his lecture. While thinking about Badiou's definition, I encountered a very strange object, which, according to its author, is a piece of architecture. The strange object is a table that the Japanese architect Junji Ishigami designed and constructed in 2006. It is an unusual object. First, its measurements. You know this better than I do. I'm not an architect, so please forgive me. Okay, it's an unusual object first because of its measurements. The table is 9.5 meters long by 2.6 meters wide and 1.1 meter in height. It is a very long table. The tabletop is a single sheet of aluminum, barely 3 millimeters in thickness. And it weighs 700 kilograms. Now, it is not hard to appreciate that with such characteristics, a normal table will collapse on itself due to the force of gravity. And here is a sketch. The definition is very bad, but at least Ishigami himself drew it. Okay. This is his sketch showing the bending of the top and the consecutive bending of the top until the whole table collapses. So for the tabletop to stay flat, some calculations must be made to counteract gravity. For example, again, Ishigami, bending it in the opposite direction. But Ishigami added further problems to the construction of his table. He added a series of objects, fruits, pots, baskets, bread, plates, flowers, which he distributed on the table and whose weight should also be a factor in order to obtain the resulting flatness of the top. After calculations, Ishigami realized that the tabletop should be rotated 1.5 times to achieve its required flatness. Again, this is his sketch. I don't know what it means, but I know that he had to do it like that. Okay. And the end result is this. Okay. Very nice. For a non-architect, this is really amusing what Ishigami constructed. And there's one last comment on Ishigami's table. The table is so unstable after construction. It's so unstable that if you barely touch it with your fingertips, it starts making waves as if it were a mass of water. If you haven't seen this, in YouTube, there's a little film of Ishigami's table. It's really nice. Now, we can ask ourselves, what did Ishigami accomplish? Is it architecture, as he claims? Is it a table, as he also claims? If we follow Badiou's definition, it is neither. It is not architecture and it is not a table. It is not a table because it is a table only under extreme conditions. You can't use it, you can't touch it, and only visually a victim of the imaginary. It is a table in the same sense that Magritte's pipe is and is not a pipe. You cannot place things on it, nor extract things from it. You can't eat on it. You can't even touch it. On the other hand, it is not architecture, because, as Badiou would say, it is still too hung up on the unity of the symbolic. What unity is this? The unity of the structural calculus that will support the unstable integrity of the table, plus the symbolic game of exhibiting objects on the table as if they were words on a dictionary. That is, what is being exhibited is the raw power of objects to designate themselves outside of any other context that is not properly linguistic. This is bread, this is a fork, this is a vase, even this is a table. Indeed, what Ishigami's table obscures is that it is its construction that is being exhibited, and not the object on top of it. Not even a table is being exhibited. What Ishigami exhibits is a purely differential symbolic calculus that holds everything together under extreme conditions of observation. So here I would like to open a different flank to examine Badiou's definition. I would like to suggest that Ishigami's table is not architecture, but it's a poem, or something very close to a poem. And I will do so by stating that the poem is the result of a different interval than the one I suggested as Badiou's defining interval for architecture. Recall that in his survey of the three-way partition of the arts of contemplation, of duration, and of the body, Badiou stated in his conference that architecture didn't fit squarely in any one of them, because architecture participated in all three types of art. Badiou thus concluded that architecture was unclassifiable because architecture draws an ungraspable, elusive diagonal that runs through all these forms of art. But we also noted that in his survey of the works of art, Badiou was mute about poetry. Strangely so, because, as I said, he has written extensively about poetry throughout his books. Now, if you consider poetry in view of this three-way partition of the arts, it comes out as the exactly direct opposite of architecture. If architecture partook of all three types of art, poetry partakes of none. Poetry is not visual. On the contrary, poetry is blind. Nor is it an art of duration. If there is time in poetry, it is geological time, in that sense that it is all there at the same time. Nor is it finally an art of the body, because not even voice is indispensable for poetry. Thus, poetry occupies within the spectrum of the arts the position opposite to the one occupied by architecture. Something I believe Hegel foresaw some time ago in his lectures on aesthetics. My immediate reaction to this is that in poetry, the relevant interval must be different from the one in architecture. Thus, if architecture's interval is the one shown there, the one we just reviewed, real 2, symbolic 2 included, poetry's interval is real 1 and symbolic 2 both included. That is, poetry is confronted with a different real than architecture, not with the real 2, the real of the uninscripted body, but with real 1, what appears to be a failure of the symbolic order. What is that? I'll name it in short. It is what we linguists call syntax. And it appears, syntax, as a failure to the symbolic and of the symbolic, only because syntax cannot be symbolized. Badiou puts it differently in another context. There is no metaphor of syntax. It cannot be symbolized, but it can be formalized. In this sense, there is no signifier for syntax. In this sense also, syntax coincides, in my view, with its most biological sense. The basic structures of language uncovered by Noam Chomsky some 20 years ago are biologically determined by a process of concatenation called merge, of which a formal expression is what you see there. That is a hierarchical, non-linear structure. The idea that when you concatenate signifiers, if you have two, it's trivial, but if you have three, the concatenation is not linear. But you concatenate the third one on the previous concatenation of the first two. The really interesting structure is not this one, but this one. And this is called internal merge, which allows for displacement. What you see there, what has happened, is that you have first a concatenation of A and B. Then you create the space for C to come, but before C comes, B moves into that space. And that's the clear notion of displacement. That is the movement of an already merged element to a different position inside the structure. This process allows for such defining properties of natural language as questions, self-reflexive statements, quantification, negation, and the like. Such is syntax as real one, formalizable but not symbolizable. Now, poetry's violent interval is between symbolic 2, the lexicon of signifiers, minus the unifying grip of the big other, or if you prefer, of big grammar on one side, and this version of syntax as real. Such a violent interval is rarely seen in actual poems. But I have one to show you. I will show you one poem which exhibits all the properties I have been talking about. It is a poem by the Peruvian poet Cesar Vallejo, and was written in 1937, barely 6 months before his death. It has no title, but is commonly referred to by its first verses. Now, let's see if this works. So, okay. The poem in Spanish is on the left, of course, and then there's a translation by Maspero on the right. Okay. So I'll read the Spanish, and then I guess you can follow with the French. La paz, la avispa, el taco, las vertientes, el muerto, los decilitros, el búho, los lugares, la tiña, los sarcófagos, el vaso, las morenas, el desconocimiento, la olla, el monaguillo, las gotas, el olvido, la potestad, los primos, los arcángeles, la aguja, los párrocos, el ébano, el desaire, la parte, el tipo, el estupor, el alma. Dúctil, azafranado, externo, nítido, portátil, viejo, 13, ensangrentado, fotografiadas, listas, tumefactas, conexas, largas, encintadas, pérfidas, ardiendo, comparando, viviendo, enfureciéndose, golpeando, analizando, oyendo, estremeciéndose, muriendo, sosteniéndose, situándose, llorando. Después, estos aquí, después, encima, quizá, mientras, detrás, tanto, tan nunca, debajo, acaso, lejos. Siempre, aquello, mañana, cuánto, cuánto. Lo horrible, lo suntuario, lo lentísimo, lo augusto, lo infructuoso, lo aciago, lo crispante, lo mojado, lo fatal, lo todo, lo purísimo, lo lóbrego, lo acerbo, lo satánico, lo táctil, lo profundo. Critics have almost unanimously called this poem experimental. But remember that critics use the word experimental whenever they don't know what to say about an object they don't understand, especially one written by a notorious poet like Vallejo. In any case, they say that the poem is experimental, but they never really say what the experiment is. So let's try and say something more. It seems at first that there is no syntax in the poem, just a bunch of signifiers. In fact, there is some but very little syntax. For example, when Vallejo writes La Paz, La P at the beginning of the poem, there is syntax between the determiner La and the noun Paz, P. But it is clear that Vallejo has largely produced an object in which syntax is nowhere to be found, or hard to find, an absence. In this, it already looks very much like Ishigami's table. In both cases, we have the following: a certain construction that exhibits a series of objects. In Ishigami's case, a table that exhibits useless objects. In Vallejo's case, a poem that exhibits words, signifiers, which are equally useless. In both cases, only naming is possible, but no signifier effects. Note furthermore that what is really being exhibited in both cases are not objects or words, but a hidden absence, structural calculus in Ishigami, outright syntax in Vallejo. This, I believe, is evidence that what is being confronted in Vallejo's poem is syntax as real. What is being confronted is the impossibility to confront syntax in symbolic terms. This is why the other end of the interval is S2, symbolic 2, a symbolic without the unifying grip of grammar as the big other. Indeed, every single verse of Vallejo's poem is, in this sense, ungrammatical. Vallejo's poem suggests much more. The table on which it is set reveals an absence of syntax, but at the same time, a source of structure. I will explain. This is just the first stanza. Notice that Vallejo's poem is not just a bunch of words, but a bunch of words ordered in verses. So in traditional terms, the first stanza of the poem, the ones you see there, is an 8-verse stanza. More interestingly, each verse is constructed making use of the two most basic metric structures of the Spanish verse: the hendecasílable, an 11-syllable line, and the heptasílable, a 7-syllable line. All of Spanish poetry is written around either 11, which is called arte mayor, big art, or 7, which is called arte menor, or minor art. And this goes on all throughout the poem, not just in the first stanza. It is a conversation between 11 and 7-syllable structures, which arrange themselves ignoring or sometimes trying to destroy what is left of verse patterns. You must have to take my word for it, but the only signifier in the first stanza that cannot be integrated, I have given you in the first stanza. So for example, the first verse has 11 syllables, the second verse has 11 syllables, the third verse has 11 and then 7 syllables. The fourth one has 2 7-syllable periods. Then you have a 7-syllable verse. And then you have something very weird, which is la potestad, los primos, los arcángeles, which gives you 11 syllables. And then la aguja, the needle, right? Which cannot be integrated into the poem. Okay? And then the last 2 verses are 11, perfect 11. The only signifier in the first stanza that cannot be integrated into the 11 and 7 syllabic structure is the noun aguja, needle. And it is not an accident, I guess, that precisely the noun that names the instrument that allows one to connect pieces together is singled out in the poem as strange. It is not an accident because what is manifestly set aside by the poem, syntax, is precisely the instrument that connects the pieces together, the needle. Thus, Vallejo had to leave glimpses of the missing apparatus just to make the absence all the more conspicuous. And again, what is absent, that without which there is no language, is syntax in its crudest and barest form. Syntax as the poem's real. In more familiar terms, Vallejo's poem shows what cannot be said, that is, what cannot be symbolized. So let us regroup one final time in order to try and get to the end of this talk. Architecture is the violent interval between the real and the symbolic. So is poetry. But both face, so to say, different reals. In the case of architecture, it is a real that confronts the human body and that confronts the fact that human bodies dwell in architectural objects. Poetry, on the other hand, has syntax as its real, the biologically determined way in which we chain our signifiers in order to produce language. But both reals are such that they cannot be symbolized, only formalized. And this is why meaning is excluded from this symposium of the arts. And this is why it is only violence that can emerge from such interval. To borrow a phrase from Piera Castoriadis Olanier, it is the violence of not understanding. Thus, Badiou's definition of architecture has set the way to rethink not only Lacan's Borromean knot, but also architecture and the arts in general, especially when Lacanian concepts are used outside the clinical practice. If something, what he has shown is that the notion of interval plays a key role in this analysis. Interval as an alternative to mere intersection. To find the nature and workings of such an interval is a task that lies open in front of us. But the task is not to find an equivalent to Vallejo's poem in the realm of architecture. Again, I claim the respective reals are different. But it would be nice to have similar views of such violent, but at the same time pleasing intervals. Thank you very much for your attention.